Okay, well, this afternoon, we have our session on food and health from a sustainable ocean. And we'll begin with a talk on blue food opportunities by Jim Leape from Stanford. He's co-director of the Center for Ocean Solutions.
Thanks, Lisa. So it's great to have a chance to be here, actually, and to talk about blue foods, the role they play in food systems around the world, and why that's important to our discussion about ocean conservation. I want to start by taking a half step back to just recognize the central importance of food systems in meeting the challenge of sustainability. So if you look on land, food production now occupies half the arable land in the world. It is the principal driver of deforestation across the tropics and subtropics. It's the principal driver of biodiversity loss. It is, of course, a major source of climate change emissions. And 80% of that land devoted to food production is devoted to supporting livestock, for the production of animal source products. So that's the context within which we think about the role of food from the sea. And when I talk about blue foods, I mean blue foods produced in aquatic systems. So ocean systems are also freshwater, either captured or cultivated, and including both animals and plants. Now, blue foods are already an important part of the food system. They are a major source of nutrition for 3 billion people. They are a source of livelihoods for about 800 million people. They are a major source of export revenue for developing countries. In fact, I'm told more than all other agricultural products put together. They are also clearly an even more important part of building the food system of the future because they offer the potential for diets that are both healthier and more sustainable, with a lighter footprint on the earth. And partly for that reason, and because of the overall growth in population and in economies, it's expected that consumption of blue foods will double by the middle of the century. And yet, despite that current importance and future potential, blue foods are chronically neglected in food policy making at a national level and in food policy dialogues at the international level. Now, as I get into this, I want to acknowledge that there are challenges in blue food production systems, and we've touched on some of them already today. The poster child for this, of course, is Newfoundland cod, which until actually living memory was thought to be limitless in abundance. But then suddenly in 1992 went to zero. And that's the extreme case and the case that comes to mind for all of us. But in fact, many of the world's fisheries are currently overfished. About a third are overfished, representing about a quarter of total seafood production. And so that's a significant challenge for us as we think about the potential of blue foods going forward. For sure, part of this equation is doing a better job of managing those systems. But with that in mind, what I want to talk about today is how we begin to think differently about these foods. And this, what I'm talking about here, will start from the Blue Food Assessment, which is a project led by Stanford and the Stockholm Resilience Center in partnership with EAT and with Springer Nature. This project brought together 100 scientists from 25 different institutions around the world to produce a set of 9 papers on different dimensions of the possibilities and challenges of blue foods. 5 of those papers were published last September, just before the UN Food Systems Summit. Those are papers on nutrition, on the environmental performance of blue foods, on climate impacts on blue food systems, on demand patterns, and on the role of small-scale actors. 4 more papers will be coming out in the months ahead, currently in the review process, 1 on justice, 1 on environmental constraints, 1 on transformation of blue food systems, and a synthesis. As we go into thinking about the implications of these findings, the most important thing to recognize at the outset is that this is a sector of incredible diversity. There are more than 2,500 species that are produced for food. And in that diversity lies a lot of potential, both for optimizing the choices we make in our food system and for building resilience in that food system. Let's start with nutrition. Blue foods, or fish in particular, are generally referred to as a protein. And they are, of course, an important source of protein. But they are arguably even more important as a source of other nutrients, because many of these species are very rich in a series of micronutrients that are essential to successful human development. And so those include omega-3s, which we all think about, but also in vitamin A, vitamin B12, zinc, calcium, iron, and others. And as we think about blue foods, it's important to recognize it's not just about protein. It's also about that much richer set of nutrients that they can bring into diets. So this is one of the results of the paper on nutrition that was published in Nature in September, led by Chris Golden of Harvard. They assembled a database of more than 3,000 blue foods and a detailed accounting of the nutrient composition of every one of those blue foods. And what you see is if you look across this set of nutrients, which you can't read on the screen, I'm sorry, but if you look across this set of nutrients, almost every category of blue foods is richer in nutrients, total nutrients, than the terrestrial animal source meats. So that's small pelagics, it's clams and mussels, it's also large pelagic salmon, and so forth. And that has direct implications. A paper done by Christina Hicks a couple of years ago discovered that in many coastal nations facing nutrient deficiencies, those deficiencies could be solved with fish present in their coastal water. And to take one example, many small pelagic fish are very rich in nutrients, in part because they're eaten whole, and a single serving of most species provides a recommended daily allowance of omega-3s, of vitamin B12, of calcium. To take another example, and my personal favorite, there are many fish farmers in Bangladesh who raise carp for the marketplace. But with those carp, they also raise this tiny little fish called the mola, which is an indigenous species. The mola is a small part of the diet in Bangladesh, but it accounts for 98% of the vitamin A, about half of the iron, about a third of the zinc. So this is the opportunity of thinking differently about what blue foods can do. Now, this has implications for policy, and I won't go into all of them, but to hit the highlights. One is simply the importance of bringing blue foods into dietary guidelines, social safety net programs, school feeding programs, and so forth, taking advantage of that nutrient opportunity. The second is to make sure that we are creating the local supply chains that connect blue food production to local markets to allow it to feed in to those consumers. And then third, and maybe a bit more fundamental, is to recognize that we need to actually think of these as nutrition resources and not just economic resources, as fisheries and aquaculture. And if you integrate nutrition into management of those resources, you will make different choices about how you allocate those resources and where they are sold and consumed. So a second is environmental performance. This paper, which was on the cover of Nature, was the first to develop standardized estimates of environmental stressors. It looked at the fisheries, the sectors, so carp and trout and so forth, that account for 75% of blue food production globally in terms of volume. Principally, most importantly on the farm side, although it looked at both farmed and captured. It looked at greenhouse gases, eutrophication, land use, freshwater consumption. And the basic takeaway is that most of the mainstream species are quite comparable to chicken, which in their current impacts, and chicken is the most efficient in terms of environmental performance of the terrestrial meats. Overall, fish compares favorably to any other source of animal source protein. But if you just take one element of the research done here, if you see that those sort of beige vertical lines, that's the footprint of chicken for greenhouse gases. And you can see that most of the aquatic species are comparable or perhaps a bit better, with a few exceptions. So what does this mean? This means, first of all, that we're starting from a good place. That is relatively competitive with terrestrial source meat, much better than beef, for example, in terms of greenhouse gas impact. There is a lot of potential to improve the performance of blue food systems. And so that's restoring healthy fish stocks for the capture fisheries and dealing with problems like overfishing and illegal fishing, which Rashid will certainly touch on later. It also means reducing the use of feed in aquaculture, which is the principal source of impact, and using feeds that have lower footprints. And I suspect Timothy will touch on some of those issues as well. But one of the more surprising and I think important findings here is it's not only about improving the performance of existing systems where there's a lot of potential, but secondly is the opportunity to make better choices, to be developing blue food systems and developing markets for blue foods that are intrinsically lower in their environmental footprint, and in many cases also better nutritionally. So developing markets for small pelagic fish, for example, developing markets for the unfed aquaculture species like clams and mollusks offers a lot of potential for both improving dietary outcomes and reducing the footprint of our food production. Now, of course, blue food production, like all food production, like all of life, will be very much affected by a changing climate. And it's important here to look not only at the climate hazards we face, how is climate change itself going to affect aquatic ecosystems, but also at it in each country, how dependent is that country on blue food production from those ecosystems, and how well positioned is it to manage the upheavals that lie ahead in terms of its economic position, in terms of its governance strength. And so the analysis we've done here combines those three things: climate hazard with dependence, with an assessment of vulnerability. And what it tells us is if we continue to be on a high emissions scenario pathway, that by 2090, you see profound impacts on capture fisheries, both freshwater and marine capture fisheries. In the marine context, this is declines in productivity in many fisheries. It's also, of course, major shifts in fish stocks away from where they currently are. And you also see impacts on freshwater aquaculture, which is the heart of the aquaculture sector at the moment. If you combine these three factors together, so you're looking at climate hazard, but also looking at the dependence of individual countries on these resources and their ability to adapt to a changing climate, then you find even by 2050, 50 countries that are really facing big challenges because of that triple threat, because they're dependent, they face high hazards, and are not very well positioned to deal with them. And of course, this picture becomes much more dire if we continue on a high emissions trajectory into 2090. Now, this has a variety of implications. I mean, every food system around the world is going to need to be finding ways to manage, to anticipate the impacts of a changing climate, and that's certainly true when it comes to blue food systems. And part of that is managing other stressors which can undermine the resilience of those systems to a changing climate, and also putting in place management regimes that recognize that, for example, fish stocks are moving and that will affect governance and needs to be planned for. But perhaps one of the most important things here is that blue food systems and green food systems react differently to a changing climate. They're affected in different ways. So managing the food system together, managing blue and green together, allows you to create more resilience than if you're thinking about each just on its own. And finally, small-scale actors were a major focus of this work, and that's because they turn out to be the engine that drives this system. They account for most of the food that we actually eat, and they also account for the lion's share, more than 90% of the livelihood supported in this sector. So small-scale actors are centrally important to blue food production around the world. They are, despite that fact, often overlooked in fisheries policy and management. And they present particular challenges because the small-scale sector is wildly diverse in the way they operate, in the culture and economics of their operations, in how they relate to the resource, in what other parts of the economy they're involved. They are diverse in many different ways, which means that policy needs to have the flexibility to adapt or recognize that diversity. And the paper done here was the first to really, in a systematic way, capture the range of activities that are part of small-scale action in the sector. This has several implications that I want to flag here. I mean, one is just, as we've, I think, referred to already, the importance of rights to resources, that small-scale fishers have the ability to access the resources on which they depend. It's about inclusion to governance, in governance, which is typically now dominated by commercial interests, also by men. It is investment in fostering an innovative and entrepreneurial small-scale sector and providing the capacity support that they need to thrive. It's also recognizing and supporting the roles of women. Women are about half the workforce in the blue food sector overall, but they are also quite important in small-scale contexts and often a vitally important part of food security in their households and in their communities, but typically left out of governance and management and even invisible in oversight of the sector. Oh gosh, I'm ahead. Okay, so let me tell you what all the fuss is about. Why do we think this is important? We think this is important because for all of recent history, we have thought of fisheries and aquaculture as a natural resource managed largely for economic development and economic returns. In fact, it is a vitally important food resource and will be even more so. And although we all know that at some level, we haven't managed it that way. And policy in the fisheries domain, in the food domain, have tended not to pay attention to the opportunities that lie here. And when they do, they manage this sector as fish. But for the reasons that I've just outlined here, it is actually much more, there's much more to it than that. And so thinking about this as not just fisheries and aquaculture, but thinking about this sector as blue foods actually changes the way you think about choices that need to be made, whether you are a company or a state or a national government. And that means that it puts a spotlight on the potential of blue foods to meet pressing food system challenges, to meet the challenges of nutrient deficiencies, whether they are in undernourished populations or overnourished populations, the opportunity to actually support livelihoods that are currently invisible in the economy. Also, I should note, to support cultural traditions which are often centrally important to the communities who harvest these fish. So if you look in terms of that whole suite of food system goals, if you look in terms of the whole suite of SDGs, you realize that blue food, we can do much more with the opportunity of blue foods than we currently do. Secondly, what you get out of this is, as I mentioned a minute ago, that the heart of that is small-scale actors, and that recognizing that finding ways to foster the role of small-scale actors in this sector really has many, many payoffs. And finally, to recognize the power of the diversity that is there. As you've probably inferred from the things that I've said, you may have noticed that small pelagics and clams and mussels are at the very top of the list in terms of richness and nutrients. They are also at the very top of the list in terms of environmental performance. So there are actual win-wins here, which doesn't happen very often in our business, but opportunities to actually improve outcomes overall across the spectrum of interest if we pay more attention to what can be done with that diversity. And this is, for related reasons, then also an opportunity to enlist a broader set of constituencies. One of the things that animated our research was a recognition that blue food decisions, that fisheries ministries were not often at the main table of government decision-making, right? They're often on the margins, and some of them enjoy that, but they aren't where the power is in governments. And bringing these issues and possibilities onto the screens of officials who really do have the power in government is an important opportunity to provoke better stewardship of these resources. So one of the things that prompted that insight was this survey done in 2017, just about the time of the last UN Ocean Conference, survey of more than 2,000 development policymakers in 126 developing countries. They were asked, each of them, to name their top 6 priorities among the SDGs, and 5% of them had SDG 14 on that list. So oceans just doesn't make the cut, right? And so bringing oceans into the thinking of other ministries is actually quite important to making progress on these issues. And that means helping health ministers understand that better fisheries management is in fact a public health intervention. Right? Helping development ministers understand that coastal development is not just about tourism and large-scale aquaculture. There are small-scale fishers there who are really important to your development objectives. It's helping environment ministers realize that controlling pollution is not just about environmental quality generally, it's about actually protecting coastal fisheries, which are a vital part of the food system. So changing the way we think about fisheries management and also changing the constituencies and the political opportunity to drive action is, I think, the opportunity we have in the Blue Food Agenda. The opportunity, of course, to get everyone to pull together. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes for questions. Let's see. I'm going to try to get the people who have had a chance to speak the least. Oh, okay. Okay. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
That was a wonderful presentation. We know that the total tonnage take from the oceans leveled off 20 years ago or so, and aquaculture has continued to rise. Is that a continuing prospect for growth, aquaculture? And has somebody scoped out what the potential for sustainable aquaculture might be?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, this is something Rashid will speak to, I think, in spades, so I should defer to him. There are some studies that suggest that better management of capture fishery, more consistently good management of capture fisheries has some potential to increase yield, but it's not, I wouldn't say, a big part of the growth that we're looking at. You can ask Rashid this question later. I think one should expect that aquaculture is the biggest part of that growth, and it certainly has been by far it's been the fastest growing food sector overall. And that is at the moment mostly freshwater, and there's a lot of potential for sustainable expansion of freshwater aquaculture, but there needs to be real focus on what those impacts are, which is in particular a focus on siting, right, and management in places, and also this question of feed. Timothy will talk about that, but there's a lot that has been done, and a lot that can be done to reduce the footprint of feed. But yes, aquaculture would be the heart of the growth scenario. Yeah. Rashid, do you want to correct or improve?
Yeah, Jeff, you're right. I mean, it's not only stabilized, we're seeing declines actually. So yeah, in wild fish because of all the things we do. So, and you're right about a number of us have looked at the potential for rebuilding, and you could add on some estimates up to 10 million more tons of fish by good management and rebuilding. And so aquaculture has been the place where most of the growth has been. But you know what? I got a question after talking about... Oh,
you can't ask
a
question yet.
Okay, no, I was going to comment on aquaculture, which is, but maybe I should stop because I need a bit more time.
Well, we have a couple of people lined up for questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so Joaquim and then Fernando.
Jim, what's your assessment of the regulatory regimes, marine stewardship, etc., and behavior of industry following the regimes for sustainability of fisheries system and aquaculture?
Let me take questions. Oh, my mic also goes off. Okay, I should say that I'm on the board of the Marine Stewardship Council, so that's a caveat. But through my WWF years was involved with it from the beginning. I think the sustainable seafood movement has been a really important movement, both in recognizing and to some extent driving better performance, and I think in helping to change the politics around fisheries management. I think there's been more attention to sustainability, in part because you had important leaders, parts of the market, emphasizing the importance of sustainability in their own businesses. Sustainability up to this point in most of those regimes has focused on environmental performance and a sort of current best practice. And I think from the work we've done, there's several things that one would want to add to that. One is the opportunity to not only to drive better performance in existing systems, but also to be developing systems that are just intrinsically better. So on the environmental side, I think that's a big new dimension. And on the social side, there's begun to be attention to labor, to forced labor in the fishing fleet, which is a significant issue. But there are other dimensions to social sustainability, including the impacts on small-scale producers, for example, of commercial activities, and also the impacts on food security in coastal communities. And I think increasingly we should expect companies to take account of those impacts, as well as the strict environmental performance of their fishery. But I think this is a domain in which private sector initiative is actually quite important because governance is so challenged, and not least because it's a global sector. And so having at least leaders in industry pulling in the right direction is, I think, a helpful part of shifting the political dynamics in the right direction.
Really quick question because Fernando's been waiting the whole time.
I was puzzled by a statement in your presentation equaling salmon, farmed salmon to chicken. Salmons are carnivorous fish. Chicken are not carnivorous. So the feed of salmons is animal-based food, and it has a much bigger footprint than chickens.
This work? Now it's working. I don't know what the green is. I guess a couple of things, short question. I mean, this research looked quite systematically at that entire, especially greenhouse gas footprint, but also land and water and nutrient footprint of that production. So it's looked at this in quite a robust way, first thing. Yes, it is, they are carnivores. Secondly, there's been big progress in feed over the last 20 years, right? Both in reducing the amount of feed that's used and in reducing the amount of wild fish used in feed. So those ratios are much better than they were 20 years ago. And there's continued effort on that. This is not to say salmon can't get better. It's just to say when you look at that whole picture, at the moment, salmon is overall comparable to chicken. I understand that one's a carnivore and one's not, but that isn't the end of that conversation.